A magnitude 6.0 earthquake just struck the central Chilean megathrust, 33 kilometers off the coast of Valparaíso. 2 aftershocks followed within 18 minutes. By itself, statistically routine. But it happened directly inside the rupture zone of the 1730 Valparaíso earthquake, the largest known rupture in central Chilean history, the event whose tsunami crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and struck Japan. The same fault destroyed Valparaíso again in 1906. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a routine magnitude 6 on this exact fault patch has Chilean seismologists watching the next 2 weeks with unusual attention. At 21 hours, 34 minutes, and 19 seconds Coordinated Universal Time on May 31st, 2026, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck off the coast of Valparaíso, Chile. The main shock did not come alone. Within 18 minutes, 2 additional shocks hammered the same fault patch. A magnitude 4.9 at 2146, a magnitude 4.8 at 2152, 3 earthquakes on the same fault in 18 minutes. The main shock epicenter sits about 33 kilometers northwest of Valparaíso, at a depth of 25 kilometers, directly above the contact between the Nazca Oceanic Plate and the South American Continental Plate. The Chilean National Seismological Center at the Universidad de Chile classified the event as an interplate thrust. In plain language, a piece of the locked megathrust contact between 2 plates suddenly slipped by about a meter, releasing the strain that had been accumulating over decades of convergence. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center did not issue a warning. The magnitude and depth combination did not meet the threshold for transoceanic propagation. The Chilean Navy's Hydrographic Service confirmed no significant water level deviation at coastal tide gauges. By the standards of central Chile, this is a normal afternoon. 6 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or larger happen along this coast in an average week. A magnitude 6 is something the Chilean building code is designed for. Most people picked up their coffee, looked at each other for a second, and went back to their day. Initial reports from the Chilean Civil Protection Agency indicated light damage in older masonry structures in Valparaíso's historic quarter. Intermittent power flickers in the metropolitan corridor. No injuries reported. Statistically, the cluster is routine. Both's law, an empirical observation in seismology dating from 1965, says that the largest aftershock of a main shock aftershock sequence is typically about 1.2 magnitude units smaller than the main shock. For a magnitude 6.0 main shock, that predicts the largest aftershock to be around magnitude 4.8, plus or minus about half a magnitude unit. The May 31st sequence produced a magnitude 4.9, exactly at the prediction. The arrival time of 12 minutes after the main shock falls inside the standard Omori law decay window, the rate of aftershocks per unit time is most intense in the first minutes and hours after a main shock and decays. Predictably, 12 minutes is on the early side of normal, but well within 1 standard deviation. The spatial extent of the cluster, about 12 kilometers across, is normal for a subduction zone main shock aftershock sequence. By every standard measurement applied in the first 24 hours, what happened on May 31st looks like exactly what every magnitude 6 earthquake on a subduction zone is supposed to look like. There is one structural detail worth noting. The main shock was at 25 kilometers depth. The first aftershock was shallower, at 10 kilometers. The second aftershock was slightly deeper than the main shock, at 27.6 kilometers. The 17-kilometer depth spread between the events is on the wider side of typical. Most aftershocks distribute within a few kilometers of the main shock depth along the rupture plane. A wider depth spread can indicate that the main shock ruptured an asperity at the boundary between 2 larger locked patches, with stress redistribution loading both up-dip and down-dip patches simultaneously. That pattern, on a subduction zone segment that has not produced a major event in 120 years, is the kind of structural detail seismologists note carefully without being alarmed by, but here is the thing that turns this routine event into a news story. The fault patch underneath the May 31st cluster is not just any patch of subduction zone. It is the patch that produced the 1730 Valparaíso earthquake, the largest known historical rupture in central Chilean history, with an estimated magnitude somewhere between 8.7 and 9.0. It is the patch that produced the 1906 Valparaíso earthquake, the magnitude 8.2 event that killed roughly 3,800 people and leveled the modern industrial city. It is the patch that has been quiet, with no major release, since 1906, 120 years. The geometry here matters. The Nazca Plate is being shoved underneath South America at a convergence rate of approximately 66 millimeters per year. That is among the fastest convergence rates of any subduction zone on Earth. The Peru-Chile Trench, where the Nazca Plate begins its descent, lies about 100 to 150 kilometers offshore from Valparaíso. The seismogenic zone, the depth window where the two plates are in direct frictional contact and where the elastic strain that drives major earthquakes is stored, extends from roughly 15 kilometers depth at the trench down to about 50 kilometers depth. The May 31st main shock at 25 kilometers sits squarely in the middle of that seismogenic window. The depth and mechanism together tell you something specific. This was not an intraslab earthquake deep inside the descending Nazca Plate. This was not a shallow crustal event on a fault inside the South American plate. This was a megathrust earthquake slip on the actual sliding interface between the two plates. And the megathrust is the fault structure that produces the truly large earthquakes in subduction zones. Most magnitude 8 and magnitude 9 events globally happen on the megathrust contact. Most magnitude 6 events on the megathrust are not foreshocks for larger events. But every now and then, they are. What makes this particular megathrust segment loaded is the strain accumulation calculation. Geodetic measurements from the Chilean Continuous Global Positioning System Network show that the central coast near Valparaíso is moving eastward at about 40 millimeters per year relative to the stable South American interior. The full convergence rate is 66 millimeters per year. The difference, about 26 millimeters per year, is being released by aseismic processes, slow slip-on, shallow portions of the contact, and distributed deformation across the upper crust. The remaining 40 millimeters per year is being stored as elastic strain on the locked portion of the megathrust. Over the 119 years and 9 months since the 1906 earthquake, that 40 millimeters per year totals approximately 4.8 meters of slip deficit on the locked portion of the segment. 4.8 meters of strain, waiting to be released. To put that in context, the 1906 earthquake released about 6 to 8 meters of slip on average across its rupture surface. The current strain budget on the segment has refilled to within striking distance of the level that the 1906 event drained. The fault is, in the language of seismologists, late in its seismic cycle. The 1730 Valparaíso earthquake is the segment-defining historical anchor. On the morning of July 8th, 1730, the colonial city of Valparaíso at the time, a small Spanish port of 3,000 to 5,000 inhabitants, was destroyed by a magnitude 8.7 to 9.0 rupture on the central Chilean megathrust. The shaking lasted between 3 and 5 minutes. Stone buildings collapsed inward. The colonial church fell. The waterfront warehouses fell. Spanish galleons in the harbor were thrown against the docks. Estimates of the death toll in Valparaíso itself, based on surviving colonial records, range from a few hundred to 1,000 most of the city's population. The shaking was not the worst thing that happened in Valparaíso on July 8, 1730. About 30 minutes after the earthquake, the harbor drained. The water in the bay receded several hundred meters offshore, exposing the seafloor. Then the ocean came back. The first tsunami wave at the Valparaíso waterfront, estimated by modern paleoseismologists working from the historical descriptions and sediment cores, was somewhere between 8 and 12 meters high, a wall of water more than 3 stories high, full of debris from the harbor and the ruined city. The wave washed over the lower town, smashed what was left of the waterfront, and receded, taking houses and bodies with it. Multiple waves followed over the next 3 hours. The 1730 event did something else that no other Chilean earthquake before it, and very few earthquakes since, have done. It sent a tsunami across the entire Pacific Ocean. About 22 hours after the rupture, the wave arrived on the coast of Japan, 15,700 kilometers from the source. The Tokugawa shogunate kept detailed records of unusual sea events, and the entry from a coastal village in what is now Iwate Prefecture describes an anomalous sea surge on the morning of July 9th Japanese time. Wave heights of 1 to 2 meters at Japanese tide, gauges small by Japanese standards, but documented by multiple independent observers on a calm summer morning when no Japanese earthquake had occurred. In 2005, a team of paleoseismologists, led by Marco Cisternas, published a paper in Nature that matched the Japanese surge to the Chilean colonial records and reconstructed the 1730 source as a magnitude 8.7 to 9.0 rupture extending 600 kilometers along the central Chilean coast. The 1906 Valparaíso earthquake is the instrumental era sequel. On the evening of August 16, 1906, the Megathrust let go again. A magnitude 8.2 rupture, about 300 to 400 kilometers long, struck the modern port city of Valparaíso. The shaking lasted 4 minutes. Whole blocks of the central business district pancaked. The customs house collapsed. The Hotel Royal collapsed and killed dozens of guests. The contemporary Chilean government death toll was approximately 3,800. About 25,000 people were left homeless overnight. There was a tsunami wave heights of 3 to 4 meters at the immediate Valparaiso waterfront, smaller than 1730 because the rupture itself was smaller, but still destructive at the coast. The two events together, 1730 and 1906, bracket the historical record for this segment. They tell us this fault is capable of magnitudes ranging from the lower 8 class, where 1906 lives, up to the upper 8 or lower 9 class, where 1730 sat. They tell us the recurrence interval between events of this scale is somewhere on the order of 1 to 2 centuries. And they tell us that the modern city of Valparaiso, built on the same alluvial fill at the base of the same coastal hills as the colonial city, is the city that gets hit when this fault ruptures. The May 31st main shock sits inside the rupture zones of both 1730 and 1906, the same fault patch. The same modern city in the line of fire if it ruptures again at the historical scale. As of May 31st, 2026, 119 years and 9 months have passed since the last major release on this segment. The clock is running. The current Valparaiso metropolitan area has approximately 1.1 million people. The Chilean Navy's primary base sits at Valparaiso Harbor. The Chilean National Congress meets there. The historic Central Quarter is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means it cannot be retrofitted to modern seismic standards without compromising the heritage value. The container port at Valparaiso, combined with adjacent San Antonio, handles roughly 2/3 of Chilean export tonnage, including the dominant share of Chilean copper exports. Chile produces about 28% of global copper supply. A major rupture on this fault would not just be a regional disaster, it would be a global supply chain event. The modern Chilean building code is one of the most stringent in the world for earthquake resistance, progressively tightened over the decades since the 1960 Valdivia earthquake and the 2010 Mal earthquake. The 2010 Mal event, a magnitude 8.8, killed approximately 525 people across the entire affected region. That is a fatality rate of roughly 0.01% of the exposed population, more than 2 orders of magnitude lower than the 1906 fatality rate. Modern engineering has progressively improved the survivability of major Chilean earthquakes over the past century. But the historic central quarter of Valparaiso, with its turn of the 20th century masonry buildings, was not built to the modern code and cannot economically be brought up to it. The most vulnerable part of the city is also among the most populated and most economically important. This brings us to the question every seismologist watching this segment is now asking. Is the May 31st cluster a routine main shock aftershock sequence on a loaded segment, which is what most magnitude 6 events on subduction zones turn out to be? Or is it, for the first time in a century, the early signal of something much larger? The honest scientific answer requires looking at the only modern precedent we have for what an actual foreshock sequence to a major Chilean megathrust looks like. That precedent is the 2014 Equeak sequence. And it is the single most important comparison case for assessing what happened on May 31st. On March 16, 2014, a magnitude 6.7 earthquake struck off the coast of Iquique in northern Chile. Like the May 31st event, it was on the Megathrust interface. Like the May 31st event, it was a moderate earthquake on a segment with high historical strain accumulation, the Iquique seismic gap, which had not produced a great rupture since the 1877 Iquique earthquake. The first event, on March 16th, looked completely ordinary. What made the 2014 sequence different was what happened over the following 16 days. The seismicity in the area did not decay according to the standard Omori law expectation for a normal aftershock sequence. The rate of magnitude 4 plus and magnitude 5 plus events stayed elevated. 3 additional magnitude 6 class events occurred during the foreshock buildup on March 22nd, March 27th, and March 30th. And critically, the events began to migrate. The locus of seismic activity moved progressively northward, at a rate of several kilometers per day over the course of 2 weeks. The geodetic data, analyzed after the fact by teams led by Bernd Schur and Sergio Ruiz and published in Nature and Science in 2014 and 2015, showed something even more striking. In addition to the foreshock earthquakes, the plate interface was undergoing a slow slip event. Continuous global positioning system stations along the Chilean coast detected coastal deformation consistent with the plate interface releasing strain aseismically at rates 10 to 20 times higher than the background rate. The slow slip preceded the foreshocks. The megathrust contact was unlocking. And the unlocking proceeded as a combination of accelerating aseismic slip and a cascade of moderate earthquakes, each releasing strain on one fault patch and loading the next patch to the north. On April 1st, 2014, the magnitude 8.1 to 8.2 main shock ruptured, breaking approximately 200 kilometers of the plate interface. The 2014 Iquique sequence has 4 distinctive features. The foreshocks did not decay according to Omori law expectations over 16 days. The foreshock magnitude stayed in the upper 5 to lower 7 range. The events migrated spatially in a coherent direction. The sequence was accompanied by detectable aseismic slow slip on the same portion of the plate interface. The May 31st Valparaíso cluster, at the time of this video, does not exhibit any of these 4 features. The main shock magnitude is similar to the March 16th, 2014 first foreshock. The Both's law magnitude distribution is normal. The Omori timing is normal for the first 18 minutes. The spatial clustering is tight, with no migration. The geodetic data for the immediate pre- and post-event window is not yet available. The most likely interpretation, by the standard measurements applied in the first 24 hours, is that the May 31st cluster is a normal main shock aftershock sequence on a loaded segment. That assessment could change if the cluster produces additional moderate events over the coming days, if those events migrate spatially in a coherent direction, if the rate of magnitude 4 plus events stays elevated above the Omori expectation, or if the geodetic data reveals an anomalous slow slip signal, the precursor interpretation gains weight. The Chilean seismological community will be tracking all 4 of these signals over the next 2 to 4 weeks. Most magnitude 6 earthquakes on subduction zones do not produce these signals. Some do. We cannot tell prospectively. Here is what the probability framework looks like. Of the magnitude 8 class megathrust earthquakes recorded globally since reliable instrumental records began, somewhere between 10% and 20% were preceded by clearly identifiable foreshock sequences. The remaining 80 to 90% occurred without obvious precursors. Most great earthquakes happen without warning. The base rate that any given magnitude 6 on a subduction zone is a foreshock for a magnitude 8 class event on the same segment within 30 days is somewhere between 0.5% and 2%. The probability is small, but not zero. For the May 31st cluster specifically, the 3 honest interpretations sit on a spectrum. Most likely, by a wide margin, is that the cluster is routine, a normal main shock aftershock sequence on a segment that happens to have a dramatic historical record. About 90 to 95% probability. Less likely is that the cluster represents a small segment reorganization, where the main shock ruptured an asperity at the boundary between 2 larger locked patches. About 4 to 8% probability. Least likely, but most consequential if true, is that the cluster is the beginning of a foreshock sequence preceding a major rupture on the same segment within weeks to months. About 1 to 2% probability. The next 12 hours of aftershock decay will give the first piece of new data. The next 2 weeks of magnitude 4+ rates will refine the picture. The geodetic data, when it becomes available, will be the most diagnostic signal. By the end of 2 weeks, the assessment should be substantially clearer. By the end of 2 months, the question should be largely settled. The most likely outcome, by far, is that the cluster decays quietly, and the segment returns to its decades-long pattern of strain accumulation. The least likely outcomes are real but small. A magnitude 6.0 earthquake just struck the central Chilean Megathrust segment that produced the 2 most destructive earthquakes in central Chilean history. The event itself is statistically routine. The location is not. The fault patch underneath this cluster has been quiet for 120 years, and the geodetic strain accumulation on the segment is now within striking distance of the level released by the 1906 event. Seismologists are watching this cluster more carefully than they would watch a magnitude 6 anywhere else on Earth, not because the cluster itself is alarming, but because the segment it sits on is in or near the late stage of its seismic cycle. The most likely outcome is that the May 31st cluster decays quietly over the next 2 weeks, and the segment continues its long, slow march toward whenever its next major release happens. The least likely outcome is that this is the first quiet signal of something much larger. We will know more in the coming days as the aftershock pattern develops, and the Chilean seismological community will be tracking the segment closely for any sign of escalation. We will be watching too.